Pancake everyone! Today we will tell you what it was really like to live in the Wild West, without the Hollywood embellishments and beautiful stories, impoverished and unarmed cowboys, diseases and the harsh life of an ordinary person, constant clashes with bandits who wanted to get everything at once, acting incredibly cruel and cunning. All of this is in our episode today. But let's take it step by step, and first briefly review how the history of the Wild West began. In 1783, when the British-American colonies gained their independence and formed the USA, almost all the lives of European colonists were still concentrated on the east coast of the continent, where seaports provided them with communication with the whole world. Since the founding of the first English colony in 1607, Jamestown in Virginia, 2 centuries had passed before the rapid expansion to the west into the lands of Native Americans began. By the 18th century, the gaze of the colonists was increasingly turning westward into the heart of North America, to the unexplored and dangerous yet promising lands inhabited by indigenous peoples. There were fur hunters and traders, but talk of setting these vast spaces was not yet widespread. In 1804, the government organized an expedition to find a river route to the Pacific Ocean. It was led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant Clark. They were the first to cross the entire continent from east to west by land, successfully returning to St. Louis in 1806, where they had started their journey. Others followed them westward in search of new routes and lands. This marked the beginning of the conquest of the Wild West, which would last for over a century. It's important to understand that the lands being settled by hundreds of thousands of colonizers were not free. For millennia, they had been inhabited by Native Americans. Indians mostly offered little resistance. Settlers brought valuable goods with them, primarily firearms. Very often, tribes didn't realize the threat posed by the pale-faced newcomers and quickly became dependent on them. After establishing logistics and creating a foothold in the form of a town, the settlers would engage in the forceful takeover of territory from less compliant locals. All of this required time and resources, which were brought in by caravans. Therefore, the movement to the Wild West was quite slow. Hundreds of thousands of settlers ventured into unfamiliar lands filled with danger and people who didn't always warmly welcome their new neighbors. These newcomers often acted arrogantly on Native American territory. And only thanks to Hollywood, the Wild West became a place where romance borders on heroism, where courageous cowboys and beautiful ladies live incredibly adventurous lives. However, in reality, the picture created by talented directors is far from the truth. In movies and stories, heroes who seek fame and fortune are often celebrated. But even in these films, it's rarely explained where this wealth is spent in the prairies and where it came from in the first place. Let's take, for example, the most romanticized profession, the cowboy, a favorite of the ladies, an adventurer and all that. In reality, a significant part of a real cowboy's life was spent working on a farm. Rarely was it his own ranch. For the most part, a cowboy was a hired, often seasonal worker. Naturally, the range of tasks he performed included everything related to agriculture, cattle herding, planting and harvesting crops, land cultivation, and other work including marking out stables. So what do you think a cowboy could find among the cattle? A decent wage was considered to be around $15 to $20 per month, which was not considered extraordinary at the time. More profit could only be earned during cattle drives. When winter came and the volume of necessary work decreased, cowboys were quite willing to work for room and board without any frills. At the same time, as historical records show, most of them spent their money on alcohol, as it was the only available pastime for a settler. By the way, this is another big myth about the Wild West, that cowboys preferred beer over whiskey, which is actually not true. Another misconception about cowboys is that they were all men of European white descent. In reality, 1 in 7 cowboys was of African descent. Among them were famous figures like Ned Love and John Ware. There were also many Native Americans and Mexicans among them. Interestingly, contrary to popular belief, most cowboys didn't have their own weapons. Their meager salaries simply couldn't cover even the cost of an ordinary, inexpensive revolver. Skilled marksmen among Western cattle herders were more the exception than the rule. So what about fame? What fame can you achieve when you're taking care of cattle and essentially working as a laborer? There were, of course, heroes who, for example, defended against bandit attacks on properties or participated in the capture of criminals as parts of a makeshift posse. But these were very specific cases, and it's a stretch to associate them with the cowboy profession. Well, if the cowboys were poor, then the bandits must have been swimming in gold, or not? In movies, we often see wanted posters with the portraits of outlaws where a charismatic actor is displayed. Someone who needs to be found and punished, while brave bounty hunters track down the criminal and bring them to the sheriff. The reality, however, is that such portraits could cover every home in the Wild West, and even a few layers deep, the level of crime was incredibly off the charts. According to official statistics, in California, 1 out of every 72 residents was supposed to meet their demise, and in the safest state, Oregon, only 1 out of every 208. This refers specifically to violent deaths, and on top of that, thousands of people were simply reported missing. So yes, local farmers, cowboys and regular citizens were forced to take matters into their own hands without waiting for the sheriff or the justice system. The question was about plain survival, and groups and militias were organized to protect their territory outside the bounds of the law, occasionally raiding the hideouts of bandits with a preemptive strike. As a result, the romanticized story of apprehended bandits supposedly being escorted to major cities for trial was simply a myth. No one intended to treat criminals with kid gloves, and they were usually punished on the spot. There was little room for mercy, let alone morality, when it came to apprehended members of the criminal world. Interestingly, bandits quite often surrendered themselves to the sheriff when they found out that locals were planning to punish them for their crimes. After all, there was a chance of survival, and the people's justice was swift and unforgiving. But even being taken to an official jail often didn't guarantee a humane trial and predictable consequences for the criminal. Local residents themselves could act radically, attacking the place where the bandit was held, dragging them onto the streets. Why prolong the process and feed the criminal? The Wild West had wild ways, but as you can understand, even harsh punishment couldn't quench the thirst for easy money and the reckless sense of freedom in its most brutal form. In movies, we often see bathtubs filled with hot water in the middle of a bedroom, beautiful well-groomed women, and fairly neat cowboys with pearly white smiles. But what was it really like? But this is just a beautiful fiction to bring life at that time closer to modern standards, because we come to see a picturesque image, not the sad truth. In reality, there were no amenities, days and weeks without baths, living in cramped quarters. All of this was a life filled with unpleasant odors, constant illnesses, and a lack of hygiene. To better imagine the atmosphere, just picture an almost deserted place in the dust where you arrived with a caravan to build everything from scratch, gradually adding basic comforts. Sleeping was done on straw and hay mattresses, bedding wasn't changed often. As a result, cowboys had to live with inevitable roommates, lice and other insects. Rose Pender, who visited the American West from 1883 to 1888, later recalled one night when she tried to sleep. There were so many bugs and blood-sucking insects that I hardly slept. Clean water was a problem in the Wild West. Stagnant water was often infested with flies and other insects. Rainwater was collected in cisterns, often with dust and dirt. To conserve water, people refrained from washing dishes and clothes. When taking a bath, entire families bathed in the same water. Frank Clifford and John Francis Wallace wrote in their memoirs about how Mexican women washed their hair with soap made from yucca plants. After using it, their hair became soft and clean. Settlers made soap from animal fat, which was also used to make candles. Homemade soap was hard and often irritated the skin. Body odor was considered a natural part of life. Moreover, people believed that cleanliness opened up the pores, making them vulnerable to bacteria and microbes. In other words, the less you bathed, the healthier you lived. The result? Body lice and typhus, a highly contagious disease that killed between 10% and 20% of those infected. Additionally, the bites from body lice irritated the skin, and by scratching their unwashed bodies to the point of bleeding, people could introduce infections that would eventually lead to their demise. There were no toothbrushes, toothpaste or dentists. All dental problems were addressed by barbers and blacksmiths. They would use pliers to extract a bad tooth. Whiskey served as an anesthetic. Toothbrushes could be found at some large stagecoach stops. They were communal. People took turns using them. Special knives were provided for removing food particles between the teeth. These were also communal. Another problem was dust. Its presence was widespread. Dust storms and strong winds threatened the lives of livestock, destroyed crops and dirtied homes. Sarah Raymond Herndon, a young woman traveling through Montana in the 1860s, described it this way: "Dust is dreadful. It seems knee-deep in some places. I never saw anything like it. Dust stuck to our faces. We traveled 20 miles and camped for the night. After a while, the faces of our boys showed only openings where their eyes, noses and mouths should be. Bars in the Wild West didn't have chairs. All you needed was a pipe or rail along which you could rest your feet. Nearby, there was a spittoon and a towel to wipe your mouth afterward. In movies, we often see Native Americans portrayed as wild savages, armed with primitive weapons, attempting to wage war against well-groomed gentlemen with Hollywood actor faces. But as we mentioned earlier, not all Native Americans were militant savages. Many preferred trade over war. However, keep in mind that essentially the colonists shamelessly took the land of Native Americans and drove them from the places where their ancestors had lived for centuries. It's unlikely anyone appreciated this, and many settler communities faced regular attacks in retaliation for their cruel treatment. Moreover, regarding savages, that's an overgeneralization, especially concerning the early years of colonization, when locals didn't quite understand who these strangers were and how their weapons worked. Thanks to corruption, the self-righteousness of fame-seeking hunters, and time itself, the local population became quite adept at handling horses and firearms. Occasionally, they could create a real bloodbath, even in a large city, with a swift retreat afterward. And here, it would be challenging to blame peaceful towns for experiencing such violent Native American attacks, because fundamentally, they encroached on their territory. Peaceful towns mainly consisted of those who had encroached on this land using firearms. Some confrontations even escalated into local wars with full-fledged counterattacks, sieges, and guerrilla raids. But even if you're not frightened by people who simply revel in their cruelty and are willing to put up with limited amenities, you shouldn't forget about the nature of the Wild West itself, as most often it was not at the hands of others that people perished. As we mentioned earlier, the appalling lack of sanitation and almost complete absence of hygiene led to horrific disease outbreaks. For example, cholera, the most dreaded enemy of settlers. More than half of those who died on the Oregon Trail succumbed to it. The first cases were recorded in New Orleans in 1832, and from there, the contagion began its journey up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. During the 1849–50 epidemic, so many people died that newspapers reported one grave for every mile of the trail. Dysentery and diseases of dirty hands, which are now not taken seriously, should not be forgotten either. Back then, they were battled with basic means, without much hope of success. The fact that pioneers didn't pay too much attention to sanitation led to staggering mortality rates. Many people never made it to settlements. A horse could throw you, a bull could gore you, a stampede at night could trample you, you could suffer burns of any degree, get injured by a rusty nail in a wagon, and even die while attempting gymnastic maneuvers like the bridge, because tetanus antitoxin had not yet been invented. Nature was also capricious, with sandstorms, wild thunderstorms, and limited supplies of water and food. Some caravans simply lost their way in the wilderness without a single soul in sight. Around you there were coyotes, dangerous snakes, scorpions, or wild bison. While settlements tried to keep these threats at bay, on the road you constantly needed to stay on high alert. Crossing rivers was a particularly perilous endeavor. It was one of the most dangerous activities that awaited pioneers on their journey. Swollen rivers due to flooding could easily overturn wagons and drown people and oxen, with all their possessions sinking to the bottom. Thousands of people perished while attempting to cross rivers like the Kansas, North Platte, and Columbia. Movies and stories about the Wild West era are like beautifully wrapped packages that you'd better not open, as you might be deeply disappointed by the cruelty and filth inside. Thank you for watching.